I'm Mark Spindler with Lakeland Companies, and a question for Matt. You mentioned, I think, that you're actually doing some of the monitoring of the data for your customers. Was that just kind of exploratory, or do you intend on actually providing that as a service? And if so, how do you go about furnishing the resources? And I mean, it's got to be kind of a foreign area for you, I would guess.
Yes, it's definitely foreign on that. No, currently we're just kind of doing exploratory, just looking at it. Mainly we're monitoring the lease equipment on a daily basis, that the equipment that the horsepower that we're leasing out. So that's how we're kind of looking at that. But we're also going in there when there is a question or concern by one of our customers, information and saying, something doesn't look right here, and so we can then just go back and look at that and use it as a tool. So, but currently we're probably not going to get into the monitoring of the equipment. I think that's one thing that you asked. We're not going to get into the monitoring as of yet. I'm not going to say we won't consider it, but currently that's not our focus. We want them to monitor their own equipment, control their own assets, and just become to utilize their assets better.
Yeah, okay, thanks. And maybe in a little bit different direction, can you speak about the development effort, how big it was, what kind of tools were used to be able to pull this whole thing together? And is it really kind of a custom application, or were the tools available that made it, I'll call it more of a configurable, easy development effort?
I'll probably bring Josh back up for this question, part of this question. One thing that we did, or I did, is I had the vision of looking at the asset management side of this business, and so I went on a lot of job sites, probably for 2 years, going and watching people frack, and watched the utilization of the equipment, and seeing the disconnect between the three or four different levels of management. As far as Josh, I'll get Josh to kind of come up here and talk about. I gave him the vision of what I thought we wanted, and I'll let him discuss how long and all the different people that he used to make this happen.
So there were two different sides of development for this particular project. One side was actual software that was running inside the cloud. It was based on Rockwell's FactoryTalk Vantage Point services. It's not what you see today as what FactoryTalk Vantage Point was. It's a subset of what's out there. And then the other side of that was what we call the gateway, and that's it resides on a computer on the frac truck that gathers the information and then forwards that up to the cloud, the encrypting, and that little interface. It's actually pulling data from the processor, the Rockwell processor, encrypting it, and then sending up. So there was some development there because there wasn't a traditional Rockwell interface that was designed to work in that fashion. So and that one took a little bit longer because it is designed to be able to be turned on and off without ever interfacing with the cloud and save data as a kind of a store and forward method.
Any more from the audience? I have a question. Maybe I'll direct it here to John Peterson. A lot of this technology requires some people who really know what they're doing. The typical end user doesn't have the expertise in-house to do it on their own. So what are companies like OSIsoft doing in the way of services to help implement some of these?
So one of the pieces that we're doing is just making it easier to move that data around, and our strategy is much like what we saw from Matt. It is leveraging the cloud. So right now we have some customers. Nalco would be one example where they're connected to all of their customers and getting some performance information on the assets that they're helping to run better, run more efficiently, and then sending recommendations and chemicals back to those plants. And to do that, to kind of put your own together, it could be a lot of VPNs going out to 1,000 or 100 customers, which if you know VPNs, there's some security issues because as soon as you're on that VPN, you're on the network, and those are some issues. And the cloud has always been a a really nice way to go about this. I kind of call it like an escrow service up in the cloud where it's a third party. It's professional IT people like Microsoft or maybe Amazon running this thing up there. And now you're not doing a business-to-business direct communication anymore. You're doing business to this third-party IT provider. Happens to be running somebody's service. You know, we plan on selling this particular service, information exchange, but you can move the data up to the cloud. And our strategy right now then is to move it down back on-prem to the engineering center. And so a company can gather information from many, many different sites, bring it to their engineering center, run their analysis on it, have their subject matter experts look at it, and then back through that same mechanism send those recommendations, back down to those individual sites. Some of the advantages of that, you gain the subject matter experts, might know something more or better about a particular piece of equipment, but talking to Sumant on that, it's he pointed out some issues there of where that intellectual property really is in the company. I'm not sure if you want to comment on that at all.
Well, yeah. When we had this conversation, the comment I had was basically if you're talking about a piece of equipment in a power plant that's designed for whatever conditions that power plant is, the people who have operated the plant are the best people to understand the signature profile of that equipment. From that perspective, obviously there are definitely intellectual property questions there in terms of putting your data on a cloud. But the other thing is, and that's one of the reasons our remote operations center has people at least 25 years of operating experience, because you can build a signature profile for a piece of equipment based on all the parameters available, but an equipment deteriorates. After being in service for X number of years, you can have the analogy with your cars also. But after that point, and it's dependent on several other external parameters also, right? So your temperature, your ambient temperature outside, it's an extremely cold day, the equipment would behave in a different way. So all that kind of knowledge cannot be put into a third party for people to just predict how that equipment is behaving. That knowledge is internal to you, and that's where your employees are very valuable, because they are the knowledge base for that.
Okay.
Hi, Lee Richards again. John, you had mentioned that data centers in the cloud are more secure, arguably because that's what
perhaps
that's what they do. No, and I actually agree with that. My concern is a couple questions. My concern is about not the data at rest in these places, right, but the data in flight, both back and forth. Again, going up in the sense of IP security, but then coming down in the sense of backups and controls. But the question that I had is, from an acquisition standpoint, if you have this model for, let's say, 10 plants that you have available in your environment, in your landscape, and you have decided to make acquisitions of plants that are in remote areas where the in-flight is more affected because of lack of infrastructure, what have you, how are some ways that these kind of remote sites can be mitigated, or would you need to rethink your strategy at that point?
So are you implying that those remote sites wouldn't have good internet access, whether it's broadband or 3G, something like that?
For example.
Yeah.
And they would have been fine with an on-premise solution.
Right. Well, I mean, if you have poor communication to those places, it's really tough to do this type of a strategy. I mean, this comes up we see this in distribution automation, in transmission distribution of electricity, probably a bit more where some substations might not have communication, limited things there. I mean, there's some thoughts of doing, autonomous systems there, kind of acting on their own. You see that thing in in the safety equipment, the safety relays and things like that. But I think if you don't have communication to it, that's just a tough one to take the strategy.
One thing that we've done is, again, we put a processor big enough to store a significant amount of data on the units. And so if we are in a remote location where we don't have 3G or some kind of internet access to it, that it stores that for how many days, Josh? 7 days. We have 7 days worth of storage on that, and we can. So usually it will be moved back into a location where it can have come back online, and so then it is transmitted back up to the cloud for us on our stuff.
And of course, with the OSIsoft Pi system, you can get that from Rockwell as well. We could store all the data for that asset for forever, basically, pretty modest cost as well.
I'm Ilyas Mandura from Petro Rabigh. My question to Mr. Somand. I understood from the presentation that a lot of effort and investment have been done toward the automation and the remote operation management system. How you measure this in terms of performance excellence toward the KPI improvements and the payback of these investments?
So there are three categories where you measure the payback. There is a reduction in your operation and maintenance costs. That's one category. There is something called a TLA, called RSG penalties, which is basically if you don't meet your requirements or your commitments in the market penalizes you. It's number two. And the third one is measured in terms of the improvement in reliability of your equipment. So there is a metric to track that. In all three fronts, you can monetize the numbers. Obviously, O&M is a very simple one to do it, and the penalties are also pretty simple. The kind of improvements that we have seen is, for example, in 2006, we paid about $17 million in penalties to the market. And those have been reduced to about $3 million now. So typically that's how we keep track. Every year there is a target that we need to meet, and it's weighed against the cost of maintaining the center versus what the returns would be. And typically in the industry, all the power utilities that have a remote operations center, it has never been a challenge to meet these targets. Typically you would hit these targets in the first quarter.
Okay, maybe I got one last question. Maybe John. Is there one out there? Great.
Thank you for a good topic. My question, well, first of all, my name is Abdullah Khalifa from Saudi Aramco. My question is basically trying to clarify what's the remote operation management concept is bringing compared to the conventional SCADA. I mean, very much what has been described as far as the applications and the process is very much like SCADA system, and that with the addition of more of a specialized applications. I could not really see where is this management concept throughout the discussions.
So remote operation management may be a standard term that's used, but it has a different flavor in different industries. And I can speak to the power industry, right? So the concept being, from a remote location, you could be managing an asset, you could be running a plant or running a vessel or a piece of equipment, and you could do that with your SCADA application. But if you do a fleet-wide remote operations management, it's not just purely running the equipment, but trying to put a strategy together in terms of how do you play in the market for the next 1 month. Okay, what assets are going to go into an outage? Where are you going to take a maintenance outage? What's the best time to do a certain function? What kind of project capital dollars are you trying to spend on replacing a piece of equipment? All those decisions will happen only if you are able to do some sort of a management function into this remote center. And so that's the kind of flavor, that's the difference in at least what we perceive in the power generation business.
Yeah, just speaking of some other industries, there's also a people factor that weighs in on on this remote management concept too. If you can't get people to the site, I look at some of the mines in places in remote parts of Australia where you might spend $1 million per man per year just to keep the mine staffed. They're moving to autonomous mining vehicles, and they need to run that from a city. They establish a communication path, and they establish a remote communications center where there's a population that's viable. And they can keep experts on staff to actually man the mine because they can't get enough people out there willing to go. And mining's not the only industry with that kind of an issue. But when you look at those types of scenarios and the cost of people, transportation, and the availability of skilled labor to get out there, it becomes a much more viable opportunity to manage that with remote assets or from a remote center. The other thing that we're seeing is that even in what I'll call traditional manufacturing industries, things like fleet management by OEMs or machine builders is starting to take on a little bit more thrust here too. Some of the higher end OEMs are sending out machines into plants that are maybe doing packaging beverages and things like that. And they will monitor those machines. They'll get access into the plant, and they've got to go through all the security measures to get that. But at the end of the day, what they're doing is looking at the performance of not just that machine in that plant, but balancing the statistical performance across many of those machines, across many plants, in order to drive better, lower total cost of ownership for the end user community, and also help them with design issues that they may have to correct over time.
And I'll just add a couple more things. I think that's one of the big things we're seeing. We're seeing these equipment providers wanting to run that piece of equipment. And I think the way Rolls-Royce, some of the people there we've been talking to, they're no longer selling a turbine, they're selling thrust. And they're going to guarantee a certain amount of thrust over a certain period of time. And they're going to do that by being able to remote monitor that piece of equipment they should know very, very well. And certainly Saudi Aramco is doing a lot of this remote stuff. I mean, we kind of understand what you guys have been doing. And so it really is not new. So the big trends that are changing is those vendors, whether you're a chemical provider or you're an equipment provider, or you might just have subject matter expertise that you want to go sell to many, many people. So that's one of the drivers. And then we also see the cloud, being able to move this data around a lot easier and securely being a technology driver as well to make this thing go.